The Social History Society Book Prize was established in 2016 to recognise innovative scholarship in the fields of social and cultural history. Each year, we look for the best original work of historical research published in the preceding calendar year. All we ask for is for the book to be written in English by a scholar normally resident in the UK, and that it should be at least the author's second history book. The books are nominated by their publishers, so this is the third year that we're running this prize. This year, the committee was chaired by our honorary president, Professor Fahmy, and it included our honorary vice president, Professor Penny Summerfield, as well as Professors Philip Schofield of Aberystwyth and Sasha Handley of Manchester. Sasha won the prize in 2018. In the name of Social History Society, I would like to thank the committee for its work. The committee was unanimous in its decision. The prize is to be awarded to the book entitled Quest of Justice, Islamic Law and Forensic Medicine in Modern Egypt, published by California University Press, and written by Professor Khaled Fahmy of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge. Runner-up is Ian Forrester's Trustworthy Men, How Inequality and Faith Made the Medieval Church, published by Princeton University Press. While explaining its decision to award the prize to Fahmy's book, our readers expressed a true sense of admiration. They commented in particular on the book's novelty, its rich source base, and the engaging depiction of both major historical processes and ordinary people and their experiences in the pursuit of justice and his decision. This is a highly original work based upon extensive and thorough research which sheds new light on the development of the modern Egyptian state from the 19th century and accompanying cultural and social changes, especially concerning health and the law. It focuses on the place of forensic medicine, and especially autopsy, in the modernization of Egypt. Convincingly, it challenges the belief that change was due to European influence and colonization. Rather, it roots it in Egyptian culture, in Islamic law, in rulers' desire for power within the Ottoman Empire, and most importantly, in the ways in which ordinary Egyptians employed medical practices to insist on justice. For example, in cases of murder, when they believed autopsy would be helpful. The committee concluded that the book will be of major importance for specialists in Egyptian history and Islamic culture, but that it will also be accessible to others. It agreed, and I quote, that any reader would learn a lot from this book. And here is my copy, and I certainly agree with the committee. I learned greatly from this book, and I enjoyed reading it. Highly recommended. So it gives me enormous pleasure to award the prize to Professor Khaled Fahmy. Khaled, ordinarily, we would have been standing in a teeming room full of people, hundreds of people, on the second evening of our annual conference. But this year, with the coronavirus pandemic, I can only offer you the prize at a distance. I cannot shake your hand. I cannot give you the envelope with a check that you deserve. But on the plus side, we're able to have a more leisurely conversation online. I'm sitting in my kitchen, at my kitchen table. Here you are, at your sitting room. And I would like to use this opportunity to ask you a few questions about your book. And my first question is, how did you get to the subject? You have previously published on the making of modern Egypt in the 19th century, mainly from the political point of view. And now you have written this marvelous social history book. What brought you to it?
Well, first let me, before answering this question, let me say how honored and grateful I am by being awarded this very prestigious prize. It's a true honor. And as you said, it would have been a great pleasure had I been with you now in person. But this is not bad at all, this conversation we're having. In answer to your question, I think it started actually with my first book. My first book was on the Egyptian army under Mehmed Ali Pasha in the first half of the 19th century. Of course, that book touched on political issues, as you rightly pointed out, but it was actually primarily a social history of the army. And the idea in that book was whether it is possible to write the history of an army from the perspective of its soldiers. Okay. And so we know the official history of that army, but I wanted to get into the experience of soldiers when they were conscripted, when they were trained, but also their actual experience on the battle itself. But the chapter that I liked most was the aftermath of the battle. And that is a chapter that relied heavily on medical sources. So it was a chapter that attempted to write, to get close to the soldiers, literally to their bodies, to understand not the indoctrination, not the ideology of these wars, but the actual corporeal experience of the soldiers and their wives, who were dragged, for years on end. And like all big standing armies in the 19th century, venereal diseases were a particular problem and prostitution, obviously. So I dabbled into this, and I got interested in medical history as a result of this. When I finished my project, I had already got hooked into these kinds of sources. And I started to think that medicine can actually allow us to write the history of Egyptian modernization in the 19th century, because this is a big topic and it's usually typically approached from an intellectual history point of view or a political history point of view. So typically we would have accounts of great reformers. Europe looms very large, educational missions to France and to other parts of Europe, coming back to spread the word and enlighten the masses, enlightened reformers of rulers and their families, and publications and the printing press and these kinds of things. And I appreciate all of this, but I wanted to understand how all of these reforms were actually received by people. And I thought medicine can allow me to do this more so than other fields, because medicine is, in a sense, the quintessentially modern science, because medicine by its very nature touches people, literally so. And daily life in Egypt changed in Cairo as much as it did in London or Paris at around the same time, with hygienic reforms, with vaccination against smallpox, with census taking with new hospitals and hospices and new medical practices. And all of these things could never be avoided by average and less than average people. So I wanted to understand how we again have the official narrative. We have the narrative of the doctors, most of them of European doctors, but also some are Egyptian doctors. We have their patrons, that is the statesmen who finance these hospitals and these medical projects. And we have their account of how people received their very generous reforms. And usually the people come across in these accounts as either ignorant or backward or mired in their superstition and their resistance, or as ungrateful recipients of these very wonderful innovations. And I wanted to give the people a chance to answer back. Yeah. So that's how the project, how I ended up with this book.
Yeah, well, that's really absolutely fascinating and very convincing and wonderful intellectual journey. I wonder if you can take us one step further in this journey and also tell us about your quest in the archives. There is. This is how the book starts in a way, and many of us who work on social history also would immediately sympathise with it, and will sympathise with the idea of discovery and working through archival work. So tell us about it.
Yes. Well, I have been blessed, really. I think I was very, very fortunate in my quest in the archives, as you put it very generously, because I stumbled across a very, very rich trove of documents. This was not done in 1 year or in one season. At that time, when I started working on this book, I had moved from the UK to the US. My research is based in Cairo. So I would go to Egypt every summer and on my sabbatical leaves and basically go to the archives to spend the entire summer vacation reading these documents. So what the specific archival material that I read were, again, to go back to the first project, is these medical reports that were written by army doctors. And that army was disbanded in the 1840s, the early 1840s. But of course, the doctors continued to function. And by that time, they functioned in a civilian capacity. So in a sense, I tracked the paper trail. I wanted to know what happened to these doctors when they left the army, so to speak. And I also was keen to find out the experience of, as I said earlier, of average people to these doctors. And so I was asking around my friends, my colleagues, as people do in the archives, where one can find information like this. And I was given a very, very valuable advice by a colleague who said, you know what, the police records have embedded in them, in the process of investigation of serious crime, forensic medical reports. Why don't you have a look at them? So I said, well, how can I find these police reports? And he said, well, there are these publications, go and look at them, and as we do. And because the archives in Egypt are as huge as they are, they're actually not indexed. There are checklists, but no subject.
Okay.
Which makes the process of research more difficult, but also much more fun.
Yes.
It's like one discovers things. One does not really find what one is looking for. There's a constant quest, as you put it. So these police reports are just fascinating. They're fascinating on so many levels. They're actually the beginning, in my mind, of modern Arabic literary narrative style. Because this is before newspapers, this is before the novel. I'm talking now about the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. These are lengthy police reports of murder, of theft, of battery, of rape in Cairo, in the countryside. And I found a huge collection of these reports. And this is the beginning of a modern state. So the police is getting their act together. They're keeping their records. And indeed, as my friend had told me, embedded in the police report are these forensic medical reports. And I was stunned by how professional they looked and how amazingly accurate, so that, for example, they would say there is a wound entering the body between the third and fourth rib, and it punctured the lung and caused an internal hemorrhage, and that's the cause of death, or something to that effect. So I became very curious, in who these doctors were and where they were trained and how come they ended up writing these reports. And that led me to the question that connects with law, which is, what is this legal system? Because these are not Sharia court records, which are very familiar to us as historians. These are different. This is a police report. And then I discovered that these police reports are then forwarded to legal bodies that were not courts. They're called councils. So I wanted to know, what are these councils and what kind of legal system did they represent, and what's the connection between this legal system and the very familiar, old, established, venerable Sharia. And that led to the question of whether one can speak about this as a secular project. And my answer is no. This is still very much an Islamic, but a modern Islamic legal/medical system. And then the real question that I'm interested in, which is, how did people understand this? How did people interact with this system? And to my surprise, or I don't know whether surprise is the right word, to my pleasure maybe, I found out that a lot of these medical investigations and forensic medical examinations were conducted not at the behest of the state, but actually in answer to quests by people to prove a case that otherwise they could not prove. Specifically, a murder case, for example, or a rape case in which there are no witnesses, which of course is the majority of cases of murder. And that constitutes a serious problem in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. You have to have two male witnesses. Now, what if you don't have two male witnesses, but all circumstantial evidence point to one person, for example? And that is exactly the logic behind the system, whose huge amounts of records I'm finding in the archive. So it is through this process that got me into forensic medicine, and from forensic medicine to what this legal system is, and from this legal system, the big question about Islam and modernity, but answered not through intellectual history, but through this very bottom-up social history perspective.
It's absolutely marvelous, a wonderful journey of discovery, and I can only imagine these archives are with these scrolls and papers all rolled and uncovering their secrets as you do the work. I wonder if you could also tell us a little bit about one particular aspect of medical experience that you have looked at. We're living now in a time of a pandemic, and you have looked at epidemics and the treatment of epidemics in your book. So can you tell us more about this? I'm sure everybody would be very interested to have this comparative dimension and to think about our experiences in this regard.
Yes, it's something that is that I touched upon in a couple of chapters in the book, because I wanted, as I said, to understand people's reaction to modern medicine. So I had a choice. I could do a reaction to vaccination against smallpox, but this has been done before in Egypt, and I wanted to do something new. So I had a reaction to hospitals, which I removed from the book because the book was already too long. And what remained was a reaction to autopsies and reaction to quarantines. So quarantines, of course, is connected to pandemics and epidemics. And the story, briefly put, is as follows, that Egypt in the 19th century had two main epidemics that it suffered from: the plague and cholera. The plague is ancient in Egypt. Indeed, before the period I work on, for 6 centuries before the 19th century, Egypt was visited by the plague so repeatedly that it became accepted as part of nature. People say that on average, Egypt was visited by the plague once every 9 years. And some of these plagues were really devastating, carrying off maybe 1/4 of the population in a matter of maybe 6 or 7 months. So they were devastating, and people just accepted them. They accepted them the way we are now accepting this pandemic, that this is something we may have to learn to live with, something that we may not be able to eradicate in any time soon. So despite all the science that we have, I think people in 18th and 17th and 16th century Egypt came to think of the plague in this way. There are two turning points that happened in the period I study regarding the plague in particular and quarantines. The first is is another plague, metaphorical one, is the invasion of Egypt by the French under Napoleon in 1798. This, of course, is a very famous expedition, especially in Egypt. And after occupying Egypt, the idea was to expand further east and threaten British possessions in India. When Napoleon's troops invaded Palestine, their army was hit by the plague. The whole enterprise was aborted because of the plague. But before it was aborted, the French authorities back in Egypt, because Egypt is now their base, were very concerned about the plague spreading in Egypt, so they imposed quarantines. So that's the first time we see quarantines imposed in this way in Egypt nationwide. They're intimately connected. Again, I'm a social historian. I'm interested in seeing how people reacted to these new measures. And they immediately drew the connection between the military and the plague. This is an alien, foreign, occupying power that may be doing something beneficial, but there is a sinister side to what they're doing, which is the military enterprise. So this is how I read the reaction of people. The plague subsided in 1800. Kept on visiting Egypt, smaller outbreaks. And in one of them, in 1813, the new ruler of Egypt, the guy I study, Mehmed Ali, or Muhammad Ali, as he's sometimes known, depending on whether you consider him a Turk or an Arab, imposed quarantines for the first time, but he imposed them on his entourage. Okay. On his palace. And the famous chronicle of the time, Ghaberti, writes about this. So this is not so much of a turning point, but an attempt to impose quarantines to protect the ruler. The army I studied was founded in 1821. And this guy, Muhammad Ali, is founding this army for dynastic purposes to snatch Egypt out of the Ottoman Empire and entrench himself firmly in Egypt as a dynastic ruler, which he succeeds in doing. He invests an enormous amount of money in the army. And because of that, when the cholera then hits, the famous cholera epidemic of 1831-32, it came to Egypt before it came to Europe. So it came to Egypt in October of 1831 with pilgrims coming from Mecca. So Muhammad Ali at that time decided to impose quarantines nationwide, not on his, because of the army. The quarantines didn't succeed in protecting Cairo or Alexandria, but it succeeded in protecting the army. The arsenal work, the military camps, military schools, military hospitals were all saved because of quarantines. Now, the fascinating thing is that the ruler's main medical advisor and really the founder of the modern medical Egyptian establishment is a Frenchman known as Antoine Barthélemy Clot, known in Egypt as Clot Bey. Clot was a miasmatist, and as such, he did not believe in the efficacy of quarantines. Muhammad Ali, on the contrary, believed in quarantines, and he said, I don't understand how it works, but I know they work, and they saved the army. So we need to impose quarantines strictly. I don't care what you believe, you have to abide by my orders. So as it happens, it was interesting because it's the European, supposedly enlightened doctor who did not believe in quarantines. Public opinion in Europe and European travelers to Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, typically in a typical Orientalist fashion, would dismiss Muslims as resistant to modernization and to be mired in their superstition and their religion. And specifically with regards to quarantines, they made the argument that Muslims believed in God's fate. They were fatalists, and they believed that quarantines are not going to change what had been ordained by God. And sadly, this logic continues to permeate, including today, as we have seen. But as we know, this is not limited to Muslims. We have, in America, people who are equally informed by this mindset. The interesting thing is that in Egypt, the Egyptian doctors, who are all of them at that time, still all of them are Muslim, they are the ones who actually believed, like their patron, Muhammad Ali, that quarantines should be applied. The European doctors were split. In Egypt, as much as in Europe, there are those who believed in contagion, the contagionists. There are those who believed in miasmas. And it was Muhammad Ali as the main patron, the main, the statesman behind all of this, who insisted on a very, very strict imposition of quarantines. So it is the imposition of quarantines to deal with the 1831-32 cholera epidemic, which carried about 150,000 souls. And then 4 years later, in 1835, much more devastating plague epidemic, which would, in a sense, the last 200,000 people. At least these are the official figures. The real figures may be. So in my study, I wanted to understand all of this complexity, the division within the medical establishment of competing medical theories about disease etiology, the social, political, military dimensions of quarantines, but mostly the reaction of average Egyptians to these measures.
What a wonderful, another quest and another journey of discovery. Fascinating. if you were to step back, Khaled, and just think about the book as a whole, can I invite you to summarize what do you see as its most important message?
Well, there are different messages for different kinds of audiences. For the West, in a sense, I would say that Islam is not antithetical to modern science, modernity, modernization. But really, that's not my main message, honestly. My main message is that Islam means many different things to different people, as I was just explaining. It was these Muslim doctors who believed in quarantines. The clergy, Muslim clergy reaction to autopsies was complex, and it's not informed only by doctrine or dogma. It's informed by many other things. So my question is that we cannot take Islam as one lump. We have to understand it as an embedded practice, as an embedded discourse within society. We have to know who's talking in its language, in its discourse, in its name. The second message is that people's reaction to innovations, to introductions, modern introductions, can be seen to be informed by dogma, by tradition, by force of habit. But I think people are also informed by a very careful strategic analysis of what would benefit them. Just to give an example, there was ferocious resistance to vaccination against smallpox in the beginning, because people thought for some reason that this was associated with the army. They thought that this is one way to mark the bodies for conscription. But then they saw, A, that girls were vaccinated, but more importantly, that vaccination actually saves lives. So they stopped this resistance. The same thing with autopsies. Autopsies can be seen to be a violation of the sanctity of the body. But if it can uphold justice, if it can bring to justice people who would have otherwise evaded the law, then people would do it. And this is something that I personally experienced, as I say in the preface of the book, in the revolution in Egypt in 2011, when I saw people whom I respect deeply, who have lost loved ones, and who have insisted at the hands of the police by being tortured to death in police custody. And of course, there are no witnesses, either because there were no witnesses or because there are no witnesses who could step forward and testify against the police officer. Then the family would insist on an autopsy. So it is this quest for justice that I am saying we should be respectful for. We should start our narrative by listening carefully to people who may be illiterate, may be poor, may be inarticulate, but who have something profound to say. That is the beginning of my story. And all the other things about science and religion and state building come next. So it's a scholarly intervention, but I think also a moral, political one for people, especially now in the days after Floyd and after Trump and after Sisi in Egypt, to basically say, let's listen to the people and let's listen to them with respect.
Yeah, deeply humane and very moving. Thank you very much. And I want to congratulate you again and to say how happy I am that we're able to advertise this book now until next year on our website as the winning book of the Social History Book Prize for this year. Thank you and many congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor.